Hi everyone, it's Emily here. I'm just going to talk you through using the shape tools and the shape builder in Illustrator, and also some simple methods of adding gradients and textures. When you open Illustrator, you'll see the welcome screen. Click New File and choose an artboard that will give you enough room to experiment with. I'm just going to stick with A4 and landscape orientation, and I'll hit create. So in Illustrator, we've already seen a lot of these tools, but we'll be predominantly using the shape tools. So currently mine is showing to rectangle, as it was probably the most recent one I used. If you click and hold on this button, you'll see you've also got options for rounded rectangle, ellipse, star tool, and flare tool. So using rectangle, I can drag to create a rectangular shape. If I hold shift, it perfectly scales it. And once you let go of your mouse, you've got your shape created. So if I wanted an ellipse tool, I could do exactly the same. Click and drag. It will skew and distort if I just drag it, but if I hold shift, I'll get a perfect circle and let go. Now these have got some strokes, which is the outline of the shape, and a fill applied. The fill and the stroke and colour options are down here. If I was to select to have no fill, I could click this button and now my circle has no fill. But the square has got a fill, so if I was to bring the square up a level in my layer tree, and now covers the circle because that white fill is present. It's not always obvious when you have a white background, so you might want to choose a different colour to the page background. So if I want to join these together, I can use the shape builder tool. Firstly, click and select both shapes, and to do that, to make sure that both are selected, click the first one, hold shift, and click the second one. Now they're both selected, I can go to the shape builder tool, and when I hover over with my mouse, I'm giving these options. If I draw across these options, they will join together and merge to form one shape. And now when we go back to the layer tree, I only have this one shape created, rather than the rectangle and the ellipse as I had before. The reason this is useful is we can start to kind of estimate some shapes, and then we can go in and refine them with more detail, so it can be really quick when you're drawing out complex forms. If I go to the direct selection tool, this white arrow here, and then go into my shape and click, I can start to manipulate this shape by moving these around. This little circle in between a corner represents a radius. And so I can change the radius of a point. So if you want to apply this to an illustration, you can place in a sketch or drawing. So if I go File, Place, I've got this broccoli painting that I made a while ago, and I'm going to place that onto my artboard. It's come in very huge. So if I drag an arrow, we still get that distorting skewing of the size of this image, but if I hold shift, it scales down evenly, and if I hold Option or Alt, I can scale it from the center. So it's just another quick way of scaling something, especially if it's disappeared off the edge of your artboard and you can't see the points to resize. So that's gone into my layer tree, and I'm going to lock it. I'm going to create a new layer by going to the little plus here. So my layer 2 is where I'm going to put my shapes. So to create this broccoli, I'm going to create some shapes that roughly represent the form that I'm aiming for. So for these top bits, they're quite circular, they're quite regular. So I'm just going to go in with some circles. So holding Shift, and you can hold Shift and Option or Alt to resize from the center. So if I click and drag, I'm resizing from the point that I clicked at, but if I undo that and I click in the center and hold Shift and Option or Alt, I will resize from the center. I'm going to change the opacity of these shapes so that I can see the form underneath better. So if I click and drag over them, I can adapt the opacity from the Properties panel. If you can't see your Properties panel, or any other panel for that matter, they can be found in Window, and then you have a list of all the panels that are available to you. Properties is already ticked, so I'm going to leave that on. Now in the Properties panel, I can change the opacity down to something that allows me to see my forms underneath. Now I'm going to go in with a rectangle. As you can see, that has got 100% fill, so I'm going to change the opacity of that as well. And I'm going to use the transform arrow that appears when I hover near the corner of the shape to just change the size of it and the angle as well. So you can overlap these as much as possible. With this method, you're kind of having to think about the overall image rather than the individual shapes. You can go in and use the white direct selection tool to adjust some of these arrows by clicking once and then click and drag on a point. There we go. And then just carry on until you have the shape that you are looking for. You can add more points by going to your pen tool up here, hold down on this button and choose the, looks like a fountain pen nib with a plus, and that is to add anchor points. So I'm going to go and add a couple of anchor points over here and over here, and that's going to allow me to manipulate this shape in a little bit more detail. It's given quite an angular appearance. So to get rid of that angular appearance, I can go back to the pen tool and choose the anchor point tool. And then when I click and drag on an anchor point, I get the arrows to allow me to turn that sharp point into a curved point. And basically these are tangent arrows showing how great or small a curved edge to create. And then a couple more rectangles. You can be more careful with your shapes when you're doing this for real. And something like this. And then I'm going to copy that over to the other side by clicking and holding Option or Alt. These aren't quite accurate for this shape, but you get the impression, and you can go ahead and manipulate these more with those tips. And it doesn't really matter if the individual shapes look a bit odd, but it's the overall that we're looking at. And I think that will do. So before I merge these together, I'm going to create a copy of them. I'm going to put that on a new layer. So to do that, I can just literally duplicate the layer because they're all on one separate layer together anyway. So if I hold Option or Alt, click and drag the layer until I get the solid blue line, let go, now I have a duplicate. So I'm going to hide that for now, and I'll lock it as well just so I don't accidentally do anything to it. So now with layer 2, in fact actually go in and label that shapes copy. Now layer 2 is shapes. Layer 1 was our sketch. I'm just double clicking the layer to above the name to enable me to rename the layers. So now I'm going to select the shapes layer. That's this one. It's visible. And I'm going to select all of my shapes by clicking from the top left corner to the bottom right hand corner. And then I can go and select the shape builder tool. I always think it looks a bit like a cloud, so if you're struggling to remember which one it is. Now is the fun bit where you get to draw over all of the individual segments that have been created. And we'll just go up here. You can do it in stages, so if you get tired, you need a rest, you can let go and then carry on. And there we go. We have our broccoli created as a vector form. You can then change the opacity if you want to. I'm going to remove the stroke because I don't need a stroke on the outline there. You can give it a colour by double clicking in the fill and then selecting a colour. I'm going to stick to the traditional green. I'm going to get rid of the opacity, so make it 100% filled, and then I'm going to go and hide the sketch layer, and there we go. Now I'm going to reveal the shapes layer, and I'm going to unlock it. I'm going to lock my newly created broccoli shape. And the reason I'm going to do this is I'm going to use some of these shapes to add some texture. So I'm actually going to create 2 layers. I know this now. I'm going to do 1 layer of gradients and 1 layer with textures. So firstly, I'm going to copy my shapes layer again. I always want to have a duplicate. I'm going to lock and hide that. I might call that shapes copy. And then this one I'm going to call shapes gradient. This is my way of working. You might find a way that suits you better, but it's just good to keep a copy. Sometimes you can just drag a copy over to the side of the artboard. For instance, I could just hold Option or Alt, drag a copy over here, and then I've always got a spare set to work with. So to add gradients, with your shape selected, you can choose the gradient arrow here. I'm going to turn off the stroke. So if I click this panel and then select none, it takes the stroke away. Then I'm going to click on the fill panel and select gradient, and it's applied a gradient. It's not a very interesting gradient at the moment. It's black to white, so I think what I'll do is choose a nice green colour. Running too many programs, so let's close some things. To make things a little easier to see, I'm going to hide these other shapes, so I'm going to click them whilst holding Shift, and then in my layers panel we can see that these shapes, and then you can hide them. So yeah, that grey to white isn't looking very nice. Let's go to the gradient panel. So here's our gradient we've just applied. Here is a gradient panel. Again, if you can't see it, go to Window and Gradient, and it pops up. And then by double clicking in these circles, you can change the color. So I'm going to double click in there, and I'm going to use the ink dropper, which allows me to select a color from my artboard. So I'm going to choose this color, and then here I'm going to choose the same color to begin with, but what I'm then going to do is double click it, select the palette, and then in this pancake menu I'm going to change it to HSB, which is hue, saturation and brightness. That means that now I can choose a green that is a slightly less saturated or slightly lighter version of the green that I had originally picked. There we go. Then I'm going to take the opacity down on the darker color. I'm going to turn it to 0. And now we've got this slight light coming in. You can mess around with different hues if you want, so I could make that slightly yellower. Just have a play and see how it looks. There we go. And now it's getting, kind of looks like there's some light coming in from the side. You can go ahead and do that with your other shapes as well. I'm not going to go through every single shape. So what I'm going to show you now is how to add a kind of textured effect. So I'm going to copy this with Command C and Command Shift V. That will paste it in place. If you may have a different shortcut for paste in place. So to copy and paste in place without the shortcuts, you can go to Edit, Copy, Edit, Paste in place. Paste in place is really useful because it places your layer exactly in the same position as the previous layer. If I don't hit paste in place and I just put Edit, Paste, it goes into the middle of the artboard. But it's pasted it here for me. So now I'm going to apply an effect. So I go up to Effect. I'm going to use Pixelate, and I think I'm going to choose Pointillize. And that's going to give it this kind of slightly grainy texture. And then I'm going to hit OK. And now you can see I've got a grainy layer, a gradient layer, and the original shape. And it's starting to build up almost like a 3D kind of texture to the illustration. So go ahead and try that for one of your illustrations. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me and we can go over anything you're struggling with or anything you want help with. Thank you. Bye.